also, amongst other things, a member of the UK government's Climate Change Committee. He was awarded a knighthood in 1966 and appointed a Companion of the Order of Australia in 1998, both for services to science. In 2001, he was one of the first 15 life peers created. He's won many prizes, too many to mention now, but in 2007 he received the Royal Society's Copley Medal, its oldest and most prestigious award, which is given annually for outstanding achievements in research in any branch of science. We are honoured and delighted to welcome Lord May to give this year's Blackett Lecture. Thank you.
Well, it's a privilege and a pleasure to give the lecture named after Blackett, who is up the back there and who is one of my personal heroes. The members of the Operations Research Society will be more familiar with his work as one of the central early figures in that, particularly in World War II. He's also, as you've heard, an extraordinarily distinguished and versatile scientist. He actually commanded the guns on one of the boats when he was a lieutenant at Jutland in the First World War, and then he fought in the Second World War, and then also was involved in more, as it were, theoretical aspects. More than anything else, he was a citizen scientist before the concept existed. There have, of course, been many, and arguably the most influential and, like Blackett, somewhat controversial citizen scientist in the history of the Society was Banks, who was president for 42 years. They changed the rules after that. But he was a working labour peer. He wasn't a peer in the days when it was, in a sense, the top tier of the honours system. He was that as well. And his involvement in politics, largely left-wing politics, was not something that was universally approved by some of his colleagues and people in the Royal Society. His portrait is also notable. I take particular pleasure in this, narcissistically. He and I are unique in this room of presidents in being the only two who aren't surrounded by iconic objects of our profession or the trappings of office. And mine is indeed embellished, although it's a bit hard to see behind the left ear with a shadowy table tennis bat. Anyways, enough of that. What I'm going to do is talk about networks and their dynamical behaviour, and I'm going to go through a series of examples, not all at the same length. I'm going to talk first about the networks of communities of plants and animals, ecosystems, and then I'm going to talk a bit about networks of contacts that propagate or don't propagate infectious diseases, IT networks, about which we had a very interesting meeting recently about put together by Tim Berners-Lee and Wendy Hall and others, focusing on some of the social aspects, and finally on financial systems. And then right at the end, for that you'll see there are going to be some recurring themes, and then at the end I will point out some of the oversimplifications that are cautionary note on pretty much everything I said. So starting with ecology, if you look at an ecology text of the 50s, it is largely descriptive. There are some small stirrings of looking for a conceptual base, but the subject itself, the word, is only just 100 years old. The oldest society, British Ecological Society, oldest society in the world, isn't 100 years old. Then the first half of it very properly was putting in place a factual base. But then around the middle of the century, people started thinking about why things are as they are. And three of the most influential people were Elton, Hutchinson, and Robert MacArthur. And I'm not in the habit, I should say, one of my things I dislike is people who put up slides with words on them and then read you the words. So I take it you can all have read that. And when I encountered that, and I encountered it quite by accident while I was a professor of physics at Sydney, being drawn into it by a biologist there who was the co-author of what was then internationally, in this country, in the States as well as Australia, the leading ecology text, Charles Birch, a movement that was a legacy of 1968, really, social responsibility in science. And interested to find out what I was being socially responsible about, I stumbled upon this truism that complex ecological systems are more stable, and it seemed to me this was a rather dubious assumption, and the arguments were a bit shaky. And I thought, let's build a little toy model, a little metaphor of this. Let's consider a community that has n species, each of which has negative feedback elements such that were it on its own and not interacting in a dynamical way with other species, would recover from any perturbation, environmental or human created, by virtue of those internal, intra-specific dynamical mechanisms. And now, let us go on and take that system, which you represent by a matrix with all the diagonal elements being stabilizing, and let's define the units such that they're all stabilizing in characteristically unit time. And now let us connect up at random species, some certain proportion of the species with each other, with each of the interactions when you put it in from A to B being either plus or minus, so that half of all the interactions will be plus minus or minus plus, predator-prey, a quarter will be plus plus, mutualist, a quarter will be minus minus, competitors, and let them have some average strength alpha, and let's ask about that and see if it does make the matrix more stable. And you can in fact generalize a rather elegant theorem for symmetric Hermitian matrices due to Jean Wigner in quantum mechanics to such random matrices to show that in fact the connections are destabilizing, and in fact the inherent stability conferred by each individual species intra-specific interactions will be overcome, and the system will begin to lose species by virtue of instabilities if the combination of number of connections and or strength of connections, squared, exceeds unity in the units that you defined. That in effect recast the agenda of this particular theoretical search for an understanding of the structure of ecosystems. Recast it as a search for what are the atypical, I mean those things were connected at random. Real ecosystems aren't like that. Real ecosystems are the survivors of at least 500 million years of evolutionary processes acting on individual animals and thus on populations and thus on systems. And so one should ask, what are, if any, what can we discover, the special structures that food webs have that help reconcile, using all the niches that are available, complexity, with the antithetic fragility that tends to promote. And at the time, I mean, this is a theme that you're going to see recur, the notion that you begin in the simplest investigation of a field, of assuming things are connected at random, and then you realize they're not, and then you ask, what are the significance of the non-randomness? How do they affect the dynamics? Some of the suggestions that were made at the time were that predator-prey things are consistent with the system remaining stable, independent of the number of connections and the strength of them. Just as long as they're all predator-prey, they don't overturn the intra-specific stabilizing mechanisms, but mutualistic and competitive interactions do. And also, if you concentrate the interactions in small blocks rather than let them just be anywhere to anywhere, that also helps. But they were purely theoretical things, and there's a series of subsequent studies. Two of them I refer to here. One of them is particularly interesting. It's a study which actually put in not just the romantic external predators that went round visible and furry and engaging, looking a bit like us as it were, with the internal parasites, grotty things that ecologists don't find nearly so romantic, and which actually contribute more than half the predatory biomass, it turns out, rather amazingly. And also, so there are a set of things that suggest some of these tentative ideas. With modern computing, you can explore very large ensembles of imaginary food webs and ask what happens if we put lots and lots of them together at random, and then look at the end at the survivors, and you find disproportionately predator-prey. And also evidence for modularity and nested hierarchies within them. The process itself does seem to be a useful one, and one of the most interesting indications of this is that some of these structural features of today's food webs can be deduced, albeit imprecisely and tentatively, inferred from what you think were the communities in the Burgess Shale 500 million years ago. Funny little peculiar things that Stephen Jay Gould wrote so colourfully about. The fact that they're rather the same suggests there are rules to be found. So setting that aside, I'm going to move on to the second bit, infectious diseases. And I moved on personally this way as Roy Anderson and I, in the middle 70s, observed that although now mathematics and theoretical ideas were beginning to play a small but significant part in the next generation of ecology texts, still nobody was very considering of the role that infectious diseases, both viruses, bacteria, and worms and protozoa, might play in influencing the geographical distribution or the numerical abundance of plant and animal populations. And this led us to give greater prominence to this notion of the basic reproductive number, which is an essential figure of merit for any population, for us or for any others. An interesting project for the Creation Society actually would be to try and explain what R naught would have had to be for Noah and his wife once they got off the ark to have produced the appropriate number of people, given that the universe, as we all know, began, or the world began in 6004 BC. Well, maybe it's 4004 BC, I forget whether it was 4000 or 6000 years old. But for an infectious agent, it's very simply that. If you introduce one infectious person into a wholly susceptible population, on average, how many are they going to infect? If that number's less than one, then you may still be interested in what was the source of that outbreak, but it's not going to give you an epidemic, whereas if it's bigger than one, then the real problem is how you put a stop to this, and because it's going to produce a chain reaction. Most times you can't estimate R naught directly. And if you wanted to try and estimate R naught for the common cold, you've got to get some idea of how many droplets come out, what's the contact process, how many droplets you need, how many viral fragments, how many viruses you need to inhale for different infections and so on. Then you can deduce it for an endemic infection like measles in terms of, if you look at the adult population, the fraction of them that have had measles. And that'll allow you to make an estimate of what is R naught. But for sexually transmitted diseases and a few others, you can actually decompose the relevant bits. And the number of a person infected with, say, HIV, the number of people they're going to infect in the early stages of the epidemic, when essentially nobody is yet infected, is going to be the chance that they will infect an uninfected partner, beta, times the number of partners they have during the course of infection, which, in simplified terms, actually, of course, it might be more complicated if you look into the details, but in simplified terms, it's roughly the average duration of infectiousness times the number of sexual partners you acquire per unit time. And that will give you R naught. So, even before HIV, in the 70s, Jim York and Herb Hefko, Jim York's a very interesting person. He's the person who gave us the word chaos. It's another quite separate enterprise he was engaged in. A very low-key person, really extremely good. And they were interested in an epidemic of gonorrhea in the western states of the United States, and they estimated beta and duration of infectiousness and number of partners from surveys, and when they worked that out, they found R0 was less than 1, which was a bit irritating because there was an epidemic. And then they had the idea that in fact all of the things I just gave you were based on the assumption that you've got a randomly mixed population, and that it makes sense to talk of the average number of partners. They observed, suppose you have a great deal of variability in the partner acquisition rate. Suppose you've got most of the population having relatively few partners and a few super spreaders that have a very large number of partners. Then if you looked at the average number of partners, it would be too small to give you an R0 bigger than 1. But on the other hand, within a group of super spreaders, you have an R0 much bigger than 1. Which motivates that you turn back again and ask, what are the real structures of partner acquisition rate, or more generally in an infectious disease, what are the real structures of number of contacts the average person has? And they're not going to be, in general, simply much the same for everybody, with just random fluctuations around that. That is to say, it's not going to be appropriate to use a model in which the network of contacts is everybody has exactly 5 contacts, or alternatively, an Erdos, Renyi, Poisson web, where everybody has on average 5 contacts, though some have more, fewer and some have more, but there's nothing systematic about it. The variance is small. And that's characterized by a degree distribution. You ask, what percentage of the population per unit time have 1 partner, 2 partners, lots of partners? It's an interesting problem to get into, oddly enough, because one of the early findings with any of these was that women reported roughly half the number of partners of men, which actually can't be. It's got to be equal. And a very celebrated geneticist, Dick Lewontin, actually wrote an article in the New York Review of Books saying this phenomenon, there were 2 ideas that could explain it. One is that you just weren't capturing accurately the statistics of female sex workers, and that was messing it up. And the other was that women tend to underreport and men overreport. And Dick Lewontin said we'll never be able to resolve that. It's a good example of the total uselessness of the social sciences. You can just never find things out. And some bright young woman, Martina Morris at Columbia, solved that problem very elegantly. She just took all the data, and oddly enough, very disconcertingly for the French, where the reported partner acquisition data is much the same as the UK. Very disconcerting for the French. She took all these surveys, which are all fairly similar, and discarded all the people who reported more than 20 partners. And the phenomenon essentially disappeared, thus showing that it was a failure to capture the statistics of female sex workers. Anyhow, once you put that in and turn the handle on the mathematical machinery, you find an interesting thing. You find that the formula we had earlier is correct, except the epidemiologically affected average number of partners isn't the average, it's the mean square divided by the mean. And that's for a very simple intuitive reason. The very active people are more likely to get infected, and then they're more likely to infect. So the average number of partners for that formula of transmission is the mean square divided by the mean. Or you could rewrite that by saying R0 is, as we had it before with the mean number, augmented by 1 plus the coefficient of variation of the distribution, which means for a given average number of partners, and R0 might be a half if there were no variance, but the more long-tailed the distribution, the bigger R0 could be. And I think amongst other things, that perception helps explain the rather puzzling thing that different countries and different regions in different parts of the world have shown very different apparent values of R0, largely because the behaviour varies in ways such that the long tail of the distribution, which is hard to get at, but is disproportionately important, varies, and it may not be very apparent, the variation, but it has very big effects on the value of R0 and thus on the size of the epidemic. Oddly enough, before the advent of things that kept you alive, having a very large variance meant the super spreaders, if the contacts were just apportioned randomly according to other people's interactions, rather than focused mainly on people with few partners, tended to get infected early and then die, and so you minimise the size of the epidemic, which is rather paradoxical. However, I end this part of the talk by coming back to what is a recurring theme, something Roy Anderson and I pointed out in the middle 80s. If we define P star as the critical fraction of the population that you have to vaccinate to eradicate an infection, vaccinate or treat or otherwise remove from the infectious pool, and you can estimate that number, and I've left us spared you the mathematics, but that number is to a good approximation 1 minus 1 over R0. If you estimated that calculating R0 incorrectly by treating the population as randomly mixed, and then having calculated that fraction, you went about vaccinating the population at random, you would find that you have to vaccinate many more than you thought. Conversely, simply because you put the wrong value of R0 in, essentially. On the other hand, if you take advantage of the fact that you know the population is heterogeneous, and focus your attention on trying to identify the super spreaders, then you can eradicate infection with vaccinating many fewer than you thought. So you could then say, and here's a really elegant mathematical result, you then say, but how are you going to know who the super spreaders are? That's very easy. You can pick up the I squared over I factor simply by asking people to name one sexual partner and vaccinate their partner and vaccinate that person. Because the same phenomenon that gave you the breakdown that made the super spreaders identifies them. It's the same theorem that says if I pick any one of your friends, if I ask any one of you to name one of your friends, that person's likely to have more friends than you do. Now, I just digress for a moment to emphasize this theme. Very many networks that are of interest in the real world. We've just seen food webs, we've seen contact for certain, probably most infectious diseases, particularly sexually transmitted ones. We're going to see it for IT networks, we're going to see it for banking financial systems. And there are many mechanisms where you can actually ask, how did the web construct itself? To make abstract models of, particularly for IT systems, the World Wide Web, the internet. If you do that, the simplest models tend to give you so-called scale-free distributions, and there has grown up what I'm inclined to call the scale-free mafia that thinks everything is scale-free. And you can go a bit over the top with this if you're not careful, because scale-free distributions, that means the number of people who have I partners, 3 partners, 8 partners, scales like 1 over I to a power between 2 and 3, it's commonly thought. Comes out of these models. Why it's called scale-free is the ratio of the number of people, as it were, who have 20 partners to the number have 2 is the same as the number of people who have 200 to the number have 20. There's no natural scaling in it. But it does mean the variance is infinite if you've got a big enough population, which is a bit kinky because that makes R0 infinite. And you can get some misleading conclusions if you're not careful. But these long tail distributions, on the other hand, not necessarily scale-free ones, can be generated by most plausible mechanisms for generating an IT network or other sorts of social networks are long-tailed. But by and large, the scale-free mafia, to the contrary, when you look at things like signalling in cells, again, there's a sub-literature about signalling, we'll come back to that. They're much more likely to be exponential things that are not quite as extreme as the scale-free things that have sensible variance properties. Here is a beautiful picture of the internet, which does have something that closely approximates the scale-free character, but it's not. There are lots of there are more small, little connected groups than you'd think, and it doesn't have infinite variance, even in the limit when you let n go to infinity. The person who's been very influential in this is a chap called Barabasi, who's written a very nice book on it. And he independently, 15 years later, discovered this same theorem that I just gave you for vaccination. It says, suppose you have a World Wide Web which is random. Suppose you have an IT system which is randomly connected. It doesn't matter whether I attack it at random or whether I target it, because seeing as the connections are random, it doesn't matter how I attack it, I can inflict some damage on it for a given level of attack. Suppose, on the other hand, it's a scale-free web. This long tail with a few nodes heavily connected and lots with little connection. Now if I attack it at random with the same level of attack as I attack the random web, it will usually have little effect. Because although the super spreader nodes are connected to a lot, you're not likely, and there are a few of them, and you're not likely to hit one of them at random. Conversely, if you make a targeted attack, identify the highly connected nodes, you can bring the whole system down by destroying 2 or 3%. And that's a real worry for cybersecurity, apart from anything else. So that's an independent, a completely independent rediscovery in a different language, but it's the same theorem. The fourth and final bit of this talk, I am going to go on, I'm going to talk for about 50 minutes, so I've still got at least half of it left, so I probably aren't going to talk for 50 minutes either. I'm going to talk about financial systems. I got into this as an accident also in 2006, before the financial crisis came. In 2006, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and the US National Academy of Sciences put together a very prescient study. It was based on the observation that individual banks were doing increasingly complicated things to try and maximize profit, minimize risk, increasingly elaborate instruments, banks in this country doing it even more than banks in the States. That's one thing where we were even more stupid than they were. And no one was thinking of the effects on the system as a whole. So they put together a study to look at that, and they thought there may be read-across from other disciplines like food webs or infectious diseases, electricity grids. Although they quickly decided the electricity grids wasn't very helpful because people had designed electricity grids to do what they do, and the design had built in the circuit breakers. So people had thought about the system as a whole, and even then there were learning episodes, such as the thing, as you remember, that threw out all the electricity on the east coast of the United States, and interesting correlation with the birth rate of New York City. So this was the study put together, and I was drawn into it by one of my ex-graduate students who had gone on, I won't go on in detail to explain how, but it had to do with the flip side of chaos. Chaos says deterministic rules give you stuff that looks random. Maybe things that look random have elements of deterministic rules which offer a new window to predictability. And we had developed earlier a method on that basis, because it turned out the random number generator von Neumann and Ulam used for the first computer that was built in '48, a maniac computer at the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton, von Neumann-Lam's random number generator is a thing we would now call the quadratic map, chaotic thing. And if you tested their random numbers by any conventional test, they said, yes, these are random numbers. But we've had a method that we were able to predict with a high degree of confidence the next 2 or 3 or 4 random numbers. And beyond that, we begin to fail. The flip side of chaos does open a new window on very short-term predictability, and various people tried to turn this into looking at algorithmic trading. And George, who was a very creative person, observed that usually if you try to do this, the trading costs outweigh the benefits. But if you put a bit of art into it and sort of try and use your intuition to try and guess when maybe it's going to be a big flip, then in short, he ended up running Deutsche Bank Securities USA for 5 years and making more money than he was going to need in this or any other lifetime. So then himself, he went back to the university because he thought that was more fun. But he was drawn into this, and that drew me into it. And that led to sort of start asking questions of how would you put together then, in order to look at the dynamics of the system as a whole, a grossly oversimplified mathematical model for, I call it the banking system, the coupling interaction between financial institutions. And my first thought was this is going to be a lot more complicated than food webs, because in food webs, the nodes, the things that are connected up, are species, and the connections are either someone's eating you or you're eating someone. Someone's a mutualist helping you, or someone's a competitor trying to eat the things you want to eat. Whereas in a bank, it seemed to me, and I have a habit when I get into something new, which I like to think I follow conscientiously, of not learning too much at first, because that tends to channel your thinking. But once I get into it, and once I think of publishing anything, then I don't just decide to cite the relevant literature as a sort of ornament at the end, as the web increasingly makes possible. But then I go and read the literature. So what happened in this case, this is self-crazy, I decided the minimally complex node had to have at least 4 things. It had to have 2 kinds of things coming into it, namely external assets coming in from the outside world, depositors, and borrowing from other banks within the net. And 2 kinds of things going out. External assets, as it linked to mortgages or businesses and so on, external assets, and internal borrowing from other banks. And then I went and talked to a friend who spent as a consultant in the city, and he said, that's ridiculous, that's far too simple. Here, he said, is a very good paper, what I believe is a very good paper. It's a paper jointly by the Bank of England and the New York Federal Reserve Bank. Model, very, very oversimplified model, and that will educate you. And I discovered, to my intense delight, that this model was exactly what I had thought. There are 4 kinds of things, essentially. There are external assets and interbank loans. There are interbank borrowing and money coming in as deposits from outside. But I did also learn other things. The rule is that a bank has to maintain a certain amount of capital reserve, liquid reserve, to meet fluctuations in its assets. And so the balance is, you've got a given bank in this model, you might say, has a fraction theta of its total assets in interbank loans, and the remaining fraction 1 minus theta in external assets. And then it has interbank borrowing, deposits, and they've got to add up to less than the total assets, and the difference is its net worth, or capital reserve. And if something happens, if one of these assets, one or more of these assets were to go belly up, to such an extent that it exceeded your capital reserve, then the bank is deemed to fail, you're in trouble. And furthermore, the difference between that cross-hatched area and the capital reserve that could meet some of these liabilities, that compensate for those lost assets, that little difference is now going to be passed on, in the first instance, to the banks you borrowed from. It'll be passed on, divided among them, and in this diagram it doesn't look like too much. And once you've divided it by the J banks you've borrowed from, it'll look like even less. But in principle, if the shock you inflict on one of those banks, for the money they lose as you go under, is big enough to overcome their capital reserve, then you'll have subsequent failures. And although I'm not going to go into this in detail, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the Bank of England, has had this very interesting study of the toy model system. Just 25 banks, all the same size, all normalised to 1, all the same capital reserve as a fraction, gamma in relation to 1. That's the proportion of net worth in relation to total assets, and with the loans equal to the borrowing. And then they had the banks randomly connected. And to make it even simpler, the first thing I did was just make it a uniform web so I could do it analytically. What they did is take that model and then do it, run simulations, and then you would get some interesting results, but you had to intuit what had caused them. Whereas I was able to, by making an approximation of just saying each bank is connected to 5 other banks rather than on average 5 other banks, I could get analytic results which agreed to 2 or 3% with the more simulation results. However, it also seemed there are 3 kinds of bad things that can happen here if a bank goes down. It can inflict damage on other banks by defaulting on loans. It can inflict damage on other banks in the sense that the thing that destroyed its asset in the first instance, it's going to be selling off it and that asset. Something, it's manifestly gone wrong with it. Maybe people realise if you put bundles of BBB mortgages together, all you have is a bundle of BBB mortgages. Even though some credit ratings agency had waved a magic wand over it and chanted the appropriate mantra and classified it as AAA. Once it went wrong, other people saw it went wrong and they discount that asset. But even other assets that look to be in good shape, other banks are going to look at them and say, oh crikey, I've been doing the same as them. I own their asset class 3 and God, seeing as these guys are clearly incompetent, maybe I should worry, maybe I should discount that. And then that's a more confidence effect. And the most important confidence effect, which may be the worst effect of all, which we're still seeing, is everybody feels, oh, things are not good. Let me call in my loans, or at least make future loans on shorter terms, liquidity hoarding. And that's one of the biggest problems at the moment. So how do you put that in the model? The conventional models, the banks models, simply had the loan defaults. They hadn't looked at liquidity hoarding, and for the assets going down, they assumed that shock affected everybody's asset by a discount factor. So we tried to generalize that to separate real discounting from things, from, as it were, fire sales of devalued assets, which discounted them by virtue of something clearly being wrong, to dissociate that from confidence effects. So what we said is, let's suppose we've got N banks, big N banks, 100 banks, each of which holds external assets in N different categories, and of those N, C, less than or equal to N, are also held by other banks, each of the assets being held by a total of G banks. So for illustrative purposes, suppose each bank has 2 different categories of asset, each shared with one other bank. So supposing our first bank has a red and a blue asset, somebody else owns the second red, somebody else owns the second blue, and then those other 2 people own 2 other different assets. And suppose now we lose half the value of Bank 1's external asset, red asset. We'll now discount the other banks, or any other banks that held the red asset, by an exponential factor with a discount parameter alpha, and x represents the number of the 10 banks. If the first bank failed, it'd be eta minus alpha. And if it took down a couple more by a combination of that and loan shocks, it might be eta minus 3 alpha. But we would also have a weak liquidity shock from just confidence effects from this bank with the blue asset. Says, crikey, bank one has done something bad, maybe they've also screwed up on the blue stuff, so we'll discount that, but it'll be a weaker discount. And then you can run the model with all these effects, with defaults on loans, and strong liquidity shocks and weak liquidity shocks. And if we take the original 25 bank, Bank of England, Federal Reserve Bank of New York model, but put in this more complex, not just liquidity shocks, but weak and strong liquidity shocks. And now we let one bank fail by making one of the assets fail. And then we look at the knock-on effects from that in relation to the capital reserve, which these days used to be 8% or more, and before the recent crash it had shrunk down to around 4% or less. And what happens is a rather slowly falling set of things. You have to get down to quite low capital reserves before the whole system goes down. On the other hand, if you put in this, you see beta is 0. We don't have any of the confidence effects, and we don't have liquidity hoarding. If we look at what's happening here, it's just a statistical thing early on when you've got relatively high capital reserve, and a statistical thing, but by and large, it's just taking very small capital reserve, relative capital reserve, before you bring the whole system down. By contrast, once you put in significant confidence effects, once the second bank goes down, the system goes down. The system tends to look in this low part when it's just coming up. There'll be, most of the banks haven't failed, but a few did, and when they did, the whole system went down. And then halfway up, it's about half and half, but the shift in the capital reserve is quite small. It really underlines the difference of confidence effects. Now, all of this was for a model which is obviously a toy model, and I'll just say a few more things about some of the elaborations of this. First of all, what is the network of connectivity among the banks? Well, that's not the sort of thing people have kept very accurate data on. One of the things the NAS Fed study did was do a study of the connectivity within the US FedWire system, money transfer system. That's the way we send money to our daughter in Oregon. And it turned out that was an extremely non-random connection. This slide is not showing up as well as it might. It's my fault. There, of that 9,500 banks, account for a couple of trillion a day, some smallish number, I think it's 65, account for most of the transactions. There is this handful of big banks that are connected to all the little banks. Most of the little banks are just connected to one or two big banks. And you see that better on my screen than you can up there. It has echoes, interestingly, of the patterns of mutualistic association that I showed earlier in ecosystems. Some super spreader banks, as it were, and they're connected to lots of the smaller ones, and a lot of plant pollinator systems are like that. But that's only a start, and I'm not going into too much detail to this. I'm just going to re-echo in a moment a recurring theme. Ongoing work is to look at big and small banks rather than all the same size, and ask, which are more important? Is it the big banks, super spreader banks because of their size, or is it the little ones because there are more of them? And is it indeed true, as many people's intuitions suggest, that the most important effects are, in a sense, confidence effects, particularly as they're propagated in cascades of shortening and withdrawing loans. But here's one attempt, one earlier, much of this is still work in progress. So here's one of the things, work in progress, and what this shows is, this is a 100-bank system. 10 of them are big banks, 90 of them are small banks. The big banks are connected to 10 times as many banks. The small banks are connected on average to 5 banks, I think it is. And the big, no, 3, I think. I forget. Small banks are connected to fewer banks, and the big banks are connected to 10 times as many. Along here is the capital reserve held by small banks in relation to their size. This is the capital reserve held by small banks in relation to their size. And we're going to let the capital reserve held by big banks in relation to their size be variable, be the same as the small banks thing. See, it's a dimensionless number, independent of size. So it's going to be the same as the small banks multiplied by some coefficient, which is the number of links to a power psi or something. But what it really boils down to, 0 means the big banks' capital reserves are proportionately the same as the small banks. As this number increases this way, it means the big banks' capital reserves are increasingly bigger than the small banks. Whereas as we decrease that way, the big banks' capital reserves are increasingly smaller, relatively, than the small banks. And you can see the effect of this. Around 0, we get the sort of figures we were seeing before, and that would, you could just project along that cusp between the blue and the coloured and up, and you get one of the curves we were just looking at. But to a quite startling extent, big banks having, super spreader big banks having proportionately bigger capital reserves makes the system, as a system, significantly more robust, and conversely. What has happened in contrast in the real world, is that during the boom times, the big banks ran down their capital reserves much more than the small banks. Banks were up in that quadrant because they wanted to have all the capital working. And there have been proposals put forward, furthermore, not only that, but in the boom times, all the banks ran down their capital reserve because they wanted all their capital working. So the small banks ran it down, get the capital working, and the big banks, whose capital reserves were bigger because they're bigger, ran it down relatively more. And it has been suggested by many people, and I don't think it even needs a mathematical model to know that, to say, actually, the capital reserves, apart from anything else, ought to be counter-cyclical. In boom times, when people are taking more risks, for the good of the system, you ought to be having bigger capital reserves because you're taking more risks. And in bust times like now, when people are running up their capital reserves because they're more nervous, liquidity hoarding, in bust times you ought then to run down your capital reserves to get the system going again. So not only should you do it counter-cyclically rather than what we've seen, but also counter to what we've seen, you should require bigger capital reserves and bigger banks. That's what's suggested by this. Sitting on top of all of this, and I'm almost finished, is a paradox. Suppose I had 10 banks and 10 categories of asset whose values have no correlation. Suppose any one of those assets had a 1% chance of failing, of losing enough value to cause a bank holding it to fail in some given unit of time. Suppose each bank hold all of one of the assets. The chance of any one bank going down at the unit of time is 1%. The chance of the system going down is 10 to the minus 20. Now suppose every bank, people should, I mean, I realise we did start a bit late. I'm actually still significantly under time, but anybody who feels they need to go should go. I won't mind. Suppose every bank holds a tenth of each asset. You can now do a little calculation and you find the chance of any one bank going under is much less. But seeing as they're all the same, if any one goes under, they all go under, and the chance of them all going under is much more. So there's a real paradox at the heart of this. Basel I and Basel II, the international banking things, focused on the interests of individual banks and promoted homogeneity in the way they play the roulette wheels at the casino. And that was quite good for the banks, but it was bad for the system. There's a genuine tension. So the bankers who say, again, just invoking these things that are reminiscent of ecology in the 60s, when people talked about mystical concepts like the balance of nature, before we realised there is no balance of nature. Nature is a complicated mess, and things have a certain robustness, but there's no balance of nature out there any more than there's an invisible hand out there. As Joe Stiglitz is fond of saying, the reason the invisible hand is invisible, not there. Nonetheless, it's not stupid for individual bankers to say, leave us alone, don't re-regulate us, just let the market, the discipline of markets work. Because what they were doing made sense bank by bank. No sense for the whole. And that again is an example in the sense of the, well, I will just stop at this point and just say it is interesting to note in the recent crisis, as an example of that, these are the 5 biggest banks. I think it's the world's 5 biggest banks. And the blue upward sloping line is a measure of their concentration, which is to say homogeneity. And the other line is the top hedge funds, whose total assets are only 1% of the total big banks. And they tended over that same time frame from over the last 1998 to 2009, they tended to have become a bit more specialised and less homogeneous, and they've been in much less trouble than the big banks. I want to end with just a few caveats about the oversimplifications that pervaded this talk. First of all, I talked about this degree distribution. Well, the degree distribution does not fully specify the web. It merely tells you how many people have, how many people, or how many other nodes a given node is connected to, but it doesn't tell you how it chooses the nodes to which it connects. Before I turn back to that, here's another interesting thing. There's a huge volume of this work on nets, either in ecology, epidemiology, IT, or the bank, less the bank, but in cell biology, where you have a complicated system like signaling among proteins in a cell, and you get a subsample, and then you assume that characterizes the degree distribution of the net. Never mind whether the degree distribution, once you've got it, fully characterizes the net. A subsample does not necessarily characterize the net. Interestingly, there's a theorem that you can prove that says it does characterize the net if, but only if, the degree distribution is a positive or negative binomial, which includes, as a special case, random webs and exponential webs, but explicitly does not include scale-free webs. And we had quite some difficulty publishing that paper because the scale-free mafia was always one of the last to review it, and they really didn't quite like it. Because their assumption is you get a sample that's scale-free, so now the whole thing. And I said, here are two webs that have the same degree distribution. There's 8 nodes, one of them has contact with 4 others, one with 3 others, one with 1 other, and the other 5 connected to. But they're really rather different. The average distance from any one point, if you went along the thing, to any other point, the average distance in B is 20% shorter than the average distance in A. Well, they have different properties, like complicated webs make them really quite different. And possibly the most interesting and important of all is, once I tell you the degree distribution, there are 2 extreme ways you can hook it up. You can have the very highly connected people, the super spreaders, mainly interacting with other super spreaders, associative. So you can have the very promiscuous people mainly associated with very promiscuous people. At the opposite extreme, you could have the very highly connected people differentially connected to the less connected people, like in banks or systems of pollinators, or if the super spreaders in sexual transmission were predatory on shy people. And in between, there'd be the one where the connections are just made in proportion to the number of links out there, just at random. They have very different dynamical characteristics. The assortative thing for an epidemic gets the epidemic rising fastest, but if it's an epidemic that kills people, it ends up affecting the fewest number. Conversely, the disassortative network is the one that maximizes the number affected. And so I have no simple, easy take-home message for the whole of it, but those who found any of this interesting, you can Google Andy Haldane for his 2 pages on rethinking the financial network, and there's another one called Banking on the State, which is a very clever thing. And Andy is fond of saying, I should have said, the last thing I will say is, you've got to be wary of drawing analogies across disciplines. Very wary of drawing analogies between banking and ecosystems. Ecosystems are the winnowed survivors of 500 million years of evolution. Banking system, as we see it today, is not like it was 20, 30 years ago. It's very new, it's regulated and unregulated. And Andy Haldane has a wonderful way of summarising that. He says, ecosystems are survival of the fittest. If banks too big to fail, banking systems are survival of the fattest. That's it.
It's interesting hearing about the properties.
Do we have another question?
How do assets held in different currencies complicate the picture here? I mean, a bank may have assets in a number of different currencies, I guess.
Yeah. No. The things that I was discussing are deliberately oversimplified. And I think there is a use in deliberately oversimplified things, even though they don't conform to reality, because they indicate sort of general trends. And as you get a more confident understanding, then you can proceed to put in more and more detail. I am personally, and on the basis of quite a bit of experience, distrustful of the view that says you put in everything you can think of to begin with. Because too commonly, that means the bits that you really know you put in excruciating detail, and other bits which turn out to be much more important, you just make some wild guess. And I can give you chapter and verse of things like the incorrect, the foolishness of banning beef on the bone often. Taking beef off the bone was deeply silly. That was the result of a consultant's report about that thick, which had to be acted on before I got a chance to see it when I was chief scientist. I give you chapter and verse of many things like that. The first predictions of the impact of HIV in Africa, demographic impact, were made, again, with a report about that thick, excruciating detail by the World Health Organization and independently by the Population Council in New York. And the third one, on the basis of a deliberately oversimplified model by Roy Anderson and myself, which was bitterly criticised by both of the other two bodies, whose prediction was 10 times more optimistic than ours. And ours was right. That's because we had the essentials right and the details approximate. And on that basis then, the world, once they got right, the World Health Organization could build things that were more realistic and focused in different regions. But it's an interesting tension that pervades the discipline, because the capacity we have these days to model things apparently in great detail can be a boon or it can be a blessing. It depends on how you do it. That's what it is. But you're quite right that the things they found all sorts of important stuff.
I think there was another